There are two New Testament stories that really tick off a few parishioners when they hear them, and especially when I preach about them. The first is the one which tells of Jesus' visit with Mary and Martha, the sisters of Lazarus. You know, the one where Martha runs around making sure everything is ready and nice for this special guest, while Mary plops herself down next to Jesus so she can hear what he has to say. Martha is not happy with the situation and complains to Jesus, asking that he instruct Mary to give her a hand. Jesus, somewhat surprisingly, rebukes her and suggests that she chill out, put aside her worried busyness, and join her sister. The second is the parable of the prodigal son. And it's the second part of the story that gets some folks' dander up. The part where the father gets irritated with the older son, the good son, the devoted and dedicated and dependable son, who refuses to attend the party being thrown for his reprobate brother, who has come home after blowing his entire inheritance and really had no other choices if he wanted to survive. What annoys them? They don't like it when Martha, the organized workaholic, is scolded, and Mary, the lazy layabout, is praised. They don't like it when the brother who stayed home and worked hard with and for his father all his life is scolded, and the brother who totally screwed up comes back to fanfare and receives a rousing welcome. And to be honest with you, I don't blame them. It all seems very unfair. But perhaps there's more to the story. You knew I was going to say that, didn't you? And this morning I will concentrate on the older brother from the parable. Mary and Martha will have to wait for another time. Without belaboring the point, let me quickly recap what the parable gives us, and then we can proceed from there. A younger son goes to his wealthy and loving father and asks that the inheritance, which he knows he will someday receive, be given to him now. The father agrees, after which the son takes the money and runs right to the bright lights of the big city, where he squanders all of it on bad living with questionable companions. When he is broke and his friends have left, he, in final desperation, takes a job slopping hogs, the worst possible work for a Jew. And when starvation even then starts to pinch, to the point that the pigs are now eating better than he is, he realizes how much he has left behind and wonders if his father will take him back, not as a son, but as a servant, so that he can at least stay alive. He returns home, is greeted by his excited father before he even gets to the door, is welcomed profusely, and becomes the guest of honor at a giant celebration. The lost son has returned. And that's where folks too often leave the story, perhaps not realizing that what comes next is in some ways more important than what has already been articulated. The younger son's character is more exciting. The younger son's story is more sentimental. The younger son's experiences are more interesting. But in many ways, the older son is the main focal point of this parable, and we must never forget that the tale does not end with the return and with the party. We too are captured by the warmth and emotion of the account of the prodigal, as well as the love shown by a forgiving father, and we thus tend to miss what Jesus is saying about the older sons and brothers of this world, the conventional and dependable who are there when they are needed, but who are perhaps a bit prodigal in their own ways. After all, the story does not reach its climax when the younger son returns. It comes through the way the older brother responds to that return. And this parable really doesn't have a satisfactory ending because there is no definitive conclusion. We are left hanging. It is unfortunate that too often we stop reading when we get to the celebration because we like happy endings. And such an ending gives us a warm and fuzzy feeling. What happens next here is anything but warm and fuzzy. Indeed, the situation deteriorates into an argument between the father and this son, possibly for the first time in their relationship. The father wants to share his joy in the return of his younger offspring with his older offspring, but the older son will have none of it. He says, in effect, "You've got to be kidding. I didn't even know this was going on because I have been hard at work in the fields, as I am every day, and when I come home, hot and sweaty, I find this, a party, a big and elaborate party, being thrown for my no-good-for-nothing brother who wasted everything you gave him and has now come crawling back to once again take advantage of your indulgence. And who told me what was happening? One of the slaves, and only because I asked him. I can't believe it." At this part, and point in the story, the father pleads with him to put aside his anger, forgive his brother, and come inside. The older son refuses. You want me to come help celebrate? Really? For all these years I've been working like a slave for you. I have done everything you have asked of me, and never once did I refuse any request or command. Did you ever throw me a party? Have you ever given me even so much as a lousy goat with which to celebrate a good time with my friends? But now you've killed your prize calf, the best of the herd, for a son who doesn't deserve anything and has caused you nothing but heartache just because he, when desperate, comes home so that he can mooch off you some more. The father is crestfallen. Probably he realizes that his son has some very legitimate grounds for anger and complaint, but he still wants his two boys to be reconciled, and so he urges his older son to reconsider. After all, he reminds him, I appreciate that you have always been there with me and for me, and everything that I still have will someday be yours. But please share my happiness in the fact that one who I love and who I thought was dead to me has returned. The lost has been found. That's it. That's where it ends. Jesus lets his listeners draw their own conclusions. And remember who his listeners were. They were ordinary people, but also the leaders of Jewish society, the Pharisees and the scribes. Ordinary people who the Pharisees and scribes considered sinners. And Jesus associated with them. Two crowds within the crowd, two groups coming from opposite ends of the social spectrum. In some ways, I suspect that Jesus was aiming the first half of his story at these sinners, people who would have appreciated the forgiveness and love offered by the Father to his wayward son because they would have identified with that wayward son. People who would have been overjoyed when told through the parable that they too, who were ostracized by the good people, were forgiven and loved by God. And I think the second half of the story was aimed at the good people who were shocked that Jesus hung around with these other bad people, because these good people would have certainly identified with the older brother, the good son who did not sin but could always be counted upon to do the right thing. So in a sense, through the parable, Jesus was introducing the good people to themselves. They were the ones standing at the edge of the crowd when Jesus was celebrating with the prodigals. And since no ending to the story was offered, they would have had to decide what that ending would be. They would have to decide, since they were the older brother, how their altar calls would turn out. Everybody is either the younger son or the older son, and sometimes a bit of both, but mainly one or the other. Well, which are you? Which are we? I suspect we are primarily the older brother, aren't we? We live responsible and respectable lives. We obey the law, at least most of the time. We are generally moral and honest. We work hard. And we work hard out in the Father's fields. Community projects, charitable programs, service clubs, the PTA, the church. We understand the older brother. We feel his intense anger. And we don't blame him for his reaction. How did Jesus feel about him? Jesus loved him and did not speak harshly or critically of him. But I think Jesus was at least a little bit disappointed in him. There was something just a little off about him as seen through his actions and attitudes. What was wrong with the older brother? Now, let me point out 4 possibilities. I'm sure there are also others. And remember, we are the older brother. The older brother seemed to envy the prodigal son. It went beyond his peeve that his brother was getting the kind of party he never had. His refusal to attend the celebration might have been somewhat mean-spirited, but the vehemence of his reaction indicated more than that. Remember how he accused his brother of wasting his inheritance with prostitutes? Where did that come from? He certainly hadn't spoken to his brother about what had specifically happened to the money, and aside from this one comment, his one comment, prostitutes are never mentioned. Maybe he was repeating local gossip. That is the kind of thing that would have been included in local gossip. Or perhaps he was letting an overactive imagination run free with images of sultry, beautiful women at his brother's beck and call, so that while he was saying rotten dog, he was thinking, oh, lucky dog. Good people sometimes act like that. We do the right things and think the right thoughts, but maybe deep down wouldn't mind being at least a little bit bad. In one of his poems, Methodist theologian and hymnologist Charles Wesley thanks God that he has escaped committing the more serious sins, but recognizing that this has happened not so much because of his goodness, but because of his fear of the consequences. Can we relate to that? How far are we willing to go at the risk of our good names or social standing? And too often good people savor the details while expressing horror at the actions of others, do they not? They tisk with, "Can you imagine that?" while they are imagining that. The older brother was a moral man, industrious and thrifty, but at the same time he was a bit jealous of his younger brother, who seemed to enjoy life a whole lot more. The older brother, despite the fact that he stayed there, never really discovered the joys of home. He didn't seem to realize how fortunate he was to have what he had, especially such a loving father. No wonder then that he kind of asked, by complaining about never having had a party, "What have you ever given me?" The people hearing the parable knew. They knew that he, as the oldest son, would inherit 2/3 of his father's wherewithal at the time of distribution. They knew that he had been part of a successful family operation with all the prestige, the comfort, the status that went with it. He knew that he had his father's deep and generous love. So how, they wondered, could he ask such a question? Perhaps he wouldn't have if he had spent some time in the pig pen like his brother. Are we guilty of not being grateful for the blessings we possess, or sometimes of even not recognizing them? If we can be surrounded by so much good and joy and do not see them, we are poor indeed. And that applies as well to our faith lives. The religious people of Jesus' day were scrupulous in following the dictates of their faith, but they didn't seem to enjoy any of it. They worked so hard at the business of religion, but where was the lift or the sense of fulfillment? So when they saw the sinners being happy in fellowship with Jesus, they got confused and jealous. They lived in their houses of religion all their lives, but they were never happy there. Do you know anyone like that? The older brother was also a prodigal. Prodigality was obvious in the younger brother. He conspicuously and dramatically threw his life and his fortune away in dissolute living. But the older brother also wasted his life, not as dramatically and conspicuously, but just as harmfully, just as ultimately, just as tragically. This older son wasted himself not in crude and riotous living, but in mean, small, selfish living. We all know people who throw their lives away, perhaps with drugs, perhaps with alcohol, destroying their brains, their relationships, their resources. But do we not also waste our potential for complete existence with the wrong and usually selfish priorities? If our total goal in life consists of the desire for wealth and or power, we are not living up to what we could and should become. If all we want and work for is more, well, there is something wrong. There is something missing. If we don't do something worthwhile with our lives, something beyond just taking good care of ourselves, we have created our own kind of skid row. No wonder some of the most apparently successful people living in the most apparently comfortable situations can feel so unfulfilled and disappointed. The older brother did not know his own father. He had grown up and lived his entire life with his father's kindness and love, and yet somehow never seemed to really understand him. He couldn't understand how his father could love his younger brother after what he had done and give him a party when he returned. Indeed, when arguing with his father, he called the prodigal "your son," while his father tried to remind him that he was also "your brother." He simply did not fully comprehend his father's heart. Sybil Cannon of Northwest Mississippi Community College recalls an experience from her teenage years reminiscent of the older brother. Her Uncle Chester was the town drunk, and Sybil, an enthusiastic Christian who was very active in her church, despised him and made no bones ever about demonstrating it. At a revival service where she was the soloist, her uncle showed up, and when the preacher asked all Christians to stand, Sybil proudly rose. The next day, the uncle subtly observed that a few at the service who were not Christian had also stood up. Sybil got the point and laced into him for questioning the sincerity of her faith. In fact, she told him exactly what she thought of him in no uncertain terms. He quietly and meekly replied, "Sybil, I know what I am, but do you know what you are?" That was the question the older brother had to face. That is the question each of us has to face. Are the images we have of ourselves and the claims we make about ourselves reflected in the way we live our lives? In other words, do we practice what we preach? Uncle Chester's question changed Sybil's life as she realized she did not exhibit the Christian love she came to cherish and possess. She had been like the Pharisees and scribes that Jesus was also telling this parable to. The older son didn't see the love his father had for him, and he didn't want it to be extended to his brother. So I submit that the older son was also a prodigal who, despite his dependability and loyalty, his respectability and commitment, was a waster of what he possessed. We can be pretty sure he never went to the city to spend his money on riotous living. But in his prodigality, he wasted himself with his envy and anger while never understanding or appreciating the unconditional love of his father for either himself or for his brother. And how many of us, like this man and in our prodigality, get angry and envious and never understand or appreciate the unconditional love of God for us or others, especially those others who we think don't deserve it? Someone once asked preacher and pastor Friedrich Krummacher who this older brother was. Krummacher answered, "I learned it only yesterday. Myself." Despite growing up and consistently living moral and religious lives, we may in truth be just as prodigal, just as far from home, as if we had gone to a far country of corruption. But the good news is that we too can always come home, and we'll be welcomed by a loving Father who throws us a party, or depending upon where we are coming from, tells us that everything he has is ours and invites us to join the party, indeed, to make it a party by coming in.